Welcome to the Iran This Week podcast for the week ending June 24th, 2011. Let's head right into a review of this week's news about Iran. On 21 June, Reuters reported that Iran's nuclear energy chief said on Tuesday that he had held very good and transparent talks with the head of the UN Atomic Energy Agency and had invited him to visit the Islamic State's nuclear facilities. The rare meeting in Vienna between Feridun Abbasi-Davani and Director General Yukiya Amano of the International Atomic Energy Agency follows increasingly strained ties between Tehran and the UN body over the last year. Iran has rebuffed IAEA appeals for information and access to help clarify allegations of military-linked nuclear work. Abbasi-Davani, head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization, said the two sides pledged to resolve their problems through more dialogue in the future. "We don't have differences of view," Abbasi-Davani told reporters. But he did not give any details of what was discussed, and there was no sign that he had made any major concessions in the long-running fight over Tehran's nuclear ambitions. Abbasi-Davani said he had invited Amano and his colleagues to come visit anywhere they liked in all our nuclear installations. It was unclear whether any such visits would include the kind of access to officials, documents, and sites the IAEA wants. A nuclear scientist himself, Abbasi-Davani was appointed head of Iran's Atomic Energy Agency earlier this year, a few months after he was slightly wounded in a 2010 bomb attack which Tehran blamed on Israel. He has been personally subjected to UN sanctions because of what Western officials said was his involvement in suspected nuclear weapons research. On 21 June, AFP reported that Iranian President Mohammed Ahmadi-Nejad's plan to merge the Strategic Oil Ministry into an enlarged energy portfolio had been cancelled, the official parliamentary website said on Tuesday. The merger of the two ministries has been cancelled and taken off the government's agenda to merge ministries, the website quoted Hossein Sobhani-Nia, a member of the Parliamentary Management Committee, as saying. Sobhani-Nia said the decision had been made by a subcommittee made up of representatives from both parliament and the government, which had come to the conclusion that the oil ministry should remain independent because of its significance. On 21 June, the Associated Press reported about the Islamic morality police in Iran and their recent offensive on fashion. This year's crackdown has apparently expanded to include men's hairstyles and jewelry considered too Western. No official explanation has appeared for the sterner approach this season, but it fits with the steady push by Iran's ruling theocracy to reel back the liberal fashion trends that began in the 1990s, such as body-hugging coverings for women and earrings and tattoos for men, and to sweep away non-Islamic influences in universities and cultural institutions. Nearly two-thirds of Iran's parliament have signed a statement supporting the latest fight against, quote, Western cultural invasion, unquote. It's blamed for such challenges to Islamic dress code as women's headscarves push back and pants crop short to show as much leg as possible. Some 70,000 police officers have been deployed in Tehran this month to enforce the dress codes, the state news agency IRNA said. Confronting those who are not sufficiently veiled is a legitimate demand of the people, said Iran's police chief, General Ismail Ahmadi-Nejad, who was added to the U.S. sanctions list earlier this month for his alleged role after Ahmadinejad's disputed re-election in 2009. The fashion targets this year also include men's hairstyles and un-Islamic bling, such as necklaces. On 21 June, Kevin Harris, writing for the U.S. Institute of Peace's Iran primer, wrote that Iran's biggest economic problem is the growing production slump at its factories and workshops. For both workers and business elite, Iran's domestic industrial troubles are far more pressing and generating far more public anxiety than international sanctions. The biggest danger for Iran in 2011 is the combination of higher unemployment and inflation produced by government inaction, unintended consequences of subsidy reform, and dwindling foreign capital caused by banking sanctions. The issue has been described as the Rukud Tavaram, or stagflation, by Iran's leading financial newspaper, Donya-e Ektisad. To stimulate the economy, Iran's central bank devalued the international exchange rate of its currency by 11% on June 8th, a sharp reversal after years of propping up the rial. The exchange rate fell abruptly to 1,750 rials to the dollar. The bank's action was intended to help Iran's large industrial sector increase non-oil exports to its neighbors. The devaluation makes Iranian exports of cement, copper, petrochemical, and agricultural products cheaper for other countries. Yet the central bank's move may in fact only compound problems for Iranian businesses. Iran's industrial sector also needs to import machinery and raw materials, so decreasing the rial's value may hurt the economy and the nation's industry as imported goods become more expensive, noted parliamentarian Hamid Reza Fuladgar. The government's failure to support industry after reforms in energy subsidies last year is a central cause of the slump. For the general population, the regime promised $45 per person monthly to offset increased prices of basic goods, fuel, and utilities. But the government of President Ahmadi-Nejad did little to aid industries. It promised the Chamber of Commerce, industries, and mines to make loans and credits available to alleviate increased costs, but it offered no cash. It also banned businesses from increasing prices for a long list of household goods to prevent inflation. So Iranian industries were squeezed on both sides. The government provided no tangible aid as industrial costs soared, but companies were barred from raising prices to cover those costs. Under these conditions, Iran faces a looming crisis in an already ailing industrial sector. On 22 June, the New York Times reported that President Ahmadi-Nejad was seeking to repair a politically reckless rift with the country's supreme leader that was leaving Ahmadi-Nejad isolated and embattled. Ahmadi-Nejad recently portrayed their relationship as one of father and son. Conservative clerics, convinced that the ambitious messianic president remains determined to supplant them, rebuked Mr. Ahmadi-Nejad for elevating his own station. The relationship with the leader of the revolution should be the relation between the guide and the guided, growled Mojtaba Zolnur to Supreme Leader's representative to the Revolutionary Guards in a speech in Qom, Iran's religious center. What does it mean to say that my relation with the leader is like the relationship of a son to his father? This is nonsense. This is deviant discourse. Since April, an unusually public battle has escalated between the two men, long seen as ideological soulmates. Former staunch conservative allies among the clergy, in parliament, and in the military have abandoned the president in droves, voicing their allegiance to Ayatollah Khamenei while labeling the presidential circle a deviant current. Fundamentally, the fight conforms to a pattern of presidential politics that has troubled the Islamic Republic since the 1979 revolution. This system allows for two presidents, one divine and the other democratic. The divine leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, holds most of the power levels, controlling the military, the judiciary, and the state broadcasting services. The divine leader is also permanent, while elected presidents serve a maximum of 8 years. Mr. Ahmadinejad's predecessors, Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani and Mohammed Khatami, also clashed with the supreme leader over prerogatives and have gradually faded from view since leaving office. Mr. Ahmadinejad is determined to avoid that fate, and that, say Iran experts, set off the current showdown. The game they are now playing is Ahmadinejad trying to politically maneuver himself to gain more power while Khamenei tries to contain him, said Mustafa Al-Labad, director of Al-Sharq Center for Regional and Strategic Studies in Cairo. It is a struggle motivated by politics and economics being presented by some as an ideological and spiritual struggle. Esfandiar Mashai, Ahmadinejad's current chief of staff, is often named as a likely candidate to replace Ahmadinejad for president, although Mashai officially demurs that he might run. But he and Mr. Ahmadinejad are suspected of helping to license private banks and to shift government contracts away from the Revolutionary Guards, who are loyal to the supreme leader, to finance their own political goals, according to Medhi Khalaji of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. In late May, the Iranian parliament, the Majlis, voted to investigate vote buying by the Ahmadinejad government during the 2009 election, which some lawmakers charge entailed $80 for each of 9 million votes. The fact that the pro-democracy Green movement made accusations of widespread fraud in that very election was ignored. In creating a version of Iran less dominated by clerics, Mr. Ahmadinejad has evoked Iranian nationalism redolent of pre-Islamic Persia and holds that Shiite Muslims do not need the clergy to engage with the hidden imam, a messiah-like figure whom Mr. Ahmadinejad predicts will return soon. Then there is the matter of jinns. Several aides arrested in recent weeks have been charged with evoking jinns, or secret spirits, and dabbling in other dark arts. Traditional clerics abhor the president. They don't like his suggestion that he alone is so close to the hidden imam. The connotation that he has a privileged position is religiously problematic, said Vali Nasser, the author of the Shia Revival. They don't like his messianism, and they don't like his meddling in religious affairs. They see his populist, folksy brand of Shiism as a threat. Past fights pitting Ayatollah Khamenei against elected presidents stayed mostly private. They tried to remain behind the curtain, Mr. Khalaji, the analyst, said, whereas Mr. Ahmadinejad excels in the street fighter school of politics. The way he talks about Israel and the United States is the way he talks about his domestic opponents. On June 23rd, the National Journal reported that in a week in which the debate over U.S. involvement in Afghanistan swung between accusations of isolationism and calls for interventionism, former United Nations Ambassador John Bolton added his voice to the campaigns for an aggressive foreign policy, this time aimed at Iran. At congressional hearings, Bolton advocated military intervention to prevent Iran from gaining full-fledged nuclear capabilities. Now a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, Bolton said that the alternatives to military action won't prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons in a timely way. Addressing the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, he asserted that a diplomatic solution is not going to work. He and other witnesses said that countries such as Syria and Iran could gain nuclear capabilities in the very near future. Bolton predicted that Iran would gain nuclear capabilities much sooner than later. Bolton criticized the administration's refusal so far to take military action against developing nuclear regimes, advocating military intervention as an unpleasant yet necessary alternative to a future where Iran had nuclear weapons. It's a big mistake to assume, as I think the administration has, that a nuclear Iran can be derailed and deterred. Bolton's criticism of American policy regarding Iran is nothing new. By his own acknowledgement, he has advocated military intervention for the past 3.5 years. Bolton said that a lack of American military action against Iran would send a signal to other countries in the area that they, too, can successfully develop nuclear weapons without fear of retaliation from the United States. Bolton named Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey among states that he believed would likely do so. On 23 June, Al Jazeera reported that Iran's ex-deputy foreign minister, Mohammed Malekzadeh, an ally of President Ahmadinejad, had been arrested on unspecified charges, an unnamed official told the semi-official Fars news agency. Malekzadeh had resigned from his position as deputy foreign minister on Tuesday. Malekzadeh's resignation came in the wake of pressure by hardline politicians who accused him of being part of a deviant current trying to undermine the role of Iran's influential religious leaders. Some members of parliament also accused Malekzadeh of corruption. Malekzadeh was considered close to Esfandiar Rahim Mashai, the president's controversial chief of staff, who the conservatives accuse of being the head of the deviant current. Malekzadeh had been at the center of a dispute between members of parliament who opposed his nomination and Ali Akbar Salehi, Iran's foreign minister. Salehi's initial refusal to remove him prompted more than 30 parliamentarians to petition the speaker for the minister's impeachment. On 22 June, the Wall Street Journal reported that a leading member of Saudi Arabia's royal family warned that Riyadh could seek to supplant Iran's oil exports if the country doesn't constrain its nuclear program, a move that could hobble Tehran's finances. In closed-door remarks earlier this month, Saudi Prince Turki Al Faisal also strongly implied that Riyadh would be forced to follow suit if Tehran pushed ahead to develop nuclear weapons, and said Saudi Arabia is preparing to employ all of its economic, diplomatic, and security assets to confront Iran's regional ambition. At a private gathering of American and British servicemen at RAF Molesworth Air Base outside London, Prince Turki, the former Saudi ambassador to the US and UK, said that Iran is very vulnerable in the oil sector and there is more that could be done to squeeze the current government. The Arab Spring uprisings are intensifying the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, who face off across the Persian Gulf and jostle for influence with neighbors from Syria to Yemen. It's a Cold War fueled by oil and ideology between Shiite Islamists who run Iran and the Sunni Saudi royal family, each of whom consider themselves leaders of the world's Muslim populations. On 24 June, The Guardian reported that prison guards in Iran were giving condoms to criminals and encouraging them to systematically rape young opposition activists locked up with them, according to accounts from inside the country's jail system. Mehdi Mahmoudian, an outspoken member of Iran's Participation Front, a reformist political party, is among those prisoners who have succeeded in smuggling out letters revealing the extent of rape inside some of the most notorious prisons. Mahmoudian was arrested in the aftermath of Iran's 2009 disputed presidential election for speaking to the press about the regime's suppression of the movement. Mahmoudian is currently in Rajishar prison in Karaj, a city 12 miles to the west of the capital, Tehran. In various cells inside the prison, rape has become a common act and acceptable, he wrote. According to Mahmoudian and letters published on various opposition websites, political prisoners are locked up with some of the most dangerous criminals, murderers, and ex-members of armed gangs. Meanwhile, 26 prominent political activists who have been in jail since the 2009 election have written to an official prison monitoring body accusing the government's intelligence ministry and Revolutionary Guards of harassing inmates with unlawful tactics that included sexual assaults. Amnesty International, which documented rape inside Iran's prisons and interviewed victims for a 2010 report, called on Iran to launch an investigation into the recent allegations. Christiane Benedict, Amnesty International UK's Middle East campaign manager, told The Guardian that rape is a terrible crime and these allegations mentioned in the letters should be thoroughly investigated. Amnesty International has also documented the rape of male and female detainees by security officials. Many of those detained for taking part in post-election protests were tortured and did not receive fair trials. The Iranian authorities still continue to punish and persecute those who peacefully speak up against them. On 24 June, Reuters reported that the UN nuclear chief said on Friday he would consider accepting an invitation to visit Iran, but stressed that it would have to yield concrete results, urging Tehran to address suspicions of military-linked atomic activity. Yukiya Amano, Director General of the UN International Atomic Energy Agency, said he had agreed in a meeting with Iran's atomic energy head, Feryadun Abbasi-Davani, this week that the two sides needed to talk, but he said they remained far apart on substantive issues related to Iran's cooperation with the IAEA and Tehran's refusal to heed UN Security Council resolutions demanding it suspend sensitive nuclear work. Amano, who has taken a blunter approach towards the Islamic State than his predecessor, Mohammed Al-Baradei, met with Abbasi-Davani on the sidelines of a week-long international nuclear safety meeting in the Austrian capital of Vienna. Abbasi-Davani said after the June 21st meeting that he had held, quote, very good and transparent talks with Amano and that he had invited Amano to visit the Islamic State's nuclear facilities. Asked about the invitation, Amano told a news conference, I will consider visiting Tehran at an appropriate time, but a constructive, concrete result is needed if I visit. I asked for their cooperation to clarify these activities, he said. There is no difference of the view to continue the dialogue, Amano added, but of course on substantial issues there is a difference. It is obvious. And that concludes the news roundup for this week. Please send any feedback on those stories to Iran This Week, all one word, at artkeller.com. And now it's time for questions and comments from the desk of Art Keller. In testimony before the U.S. Congress this week, John Bolton urged military action against Iran to curtail Iran's nuclear program. Bolton is also a public supporter of the terrorist organization known as the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, a cult-like group long on the payroll of Saddam Hussein and one that assassinated U.S. military officers in the 1970s. Bolton is among the Washington clique that advocates using the MKO to topple the regime in Iran. Before we examine Mr. Bolton's propositions, let's examine Mr. Bolton's track record. While at the State Department, John Bolton was one of the Bush administration's leading cheerleaders for the invasion of Iraq, continually pushing the notion that Iraq was a clear and present danger because of their WMD programs, which, as we now know, Saddam had shut down long before the 2003 invasion. Bolton was then appointed a U.S. ambassador to the UN. The appointment could not be made permanent because Bolton could not win confirmation. He could not win confirmation because it came out during confirmation hearings that he had abused his authority and tried to get an analyst fired when the analyst refused to change his analysis under pressure from Bolton. Bolton wanted the analyst to say Cuba had a bioweapons program, and the analyst in question said there was no evidence of that and refused to make such assertions without supporting evidence, so Bolton tried to get him fired. Bolton was also a prominent backer of the disastrous U.S. alliance with Iraqi conman Ahmad Shalabi and Shalabi's Iraqi National Congress. Shalabi, already infamous as a bank fraudster, became even more so after he used the INC to pump falsified intelligence about Iraq's WMD into Defense Intelligence Agency channels. Bolton was one of the group of so-called Vulcans in Washington that completely ignored the CIA's warnings that Shalabi was a huckster and opportunist who could not be trusted, a warning which subsequently proved true in every particular. To add insult to injury, during his inauspicious tenure as ambassador to the UN, and yes, an ambassadorial post is usually given to someone who has at least a modicum of diplomacy in his makeup, Bolton famously said things to win friends and influence people among his diplomatic peers, such as, "If the UN building lost 10 stories, it wouldn't make a bit of difference." Now, when examining the opinions of such a paragon of insight, restraint, and good judgment as John Bolton, a man with no personal experience in either the intelligence or military arena, why shouldn't we agree with his assertion that we need to attack Iran or use a proxy group like the MEK to topple the regime? Most people, having so spectacularly blown the call on both Iraq's WMD and the utility of Shalabi's INC, would hesitate to go on the record by slapping a new coat of paint on the failed Iraq policy and suggesting we do basically the same thing in Iran, but not Mr. Bolton. If anything can be said about John Bolton, it is that he has elevated shameless, reckless, myopic political hackery to previously unseen levels. Way to raise the bar, John Bolton. And that concludes the podcast for the week ending June 24th, 2011. Please send your questions and comments on the podcast to IranThisWeek@artkeller.com. Goodbye and Khuda Hafez.